Okay. All right, so my name is Sydi, and I am going to be talking today about CSS media queries. So also, I don't know if it's queries or queries, so sorry if I switch off saying it different ways. Also, sorry I'm wearing a mask and I sound all muffled. I'm in the crossroads because the Wi-Fi went down in my apartment, so that's embarrassing. Anyway, we are going to be talking about media queries, but in order to understand what these are, we first have to understand the need for responsive screen sizing on a website. And so I am not simply online shopping on Target. I'm using their website as an example. So what first, sorry, I have so many tabs open, so I feel very scatterbrained right now. So we're gonna use this as an example of how a site responds when you make it smaller. So if you watch, we're making it smaller. So it started off like this, right? Like this big. And then as it gets smaller, it kind of takes up the white space. It remains centered. If you watch these 4 boxes at the bottom, they get smaller and smaller until eventually they column out and they go into 2 separate rows. And so I actually haven't tried getting smaller than this. I don't know if it gets smaller. It's really not going any smaller. But anyway, so that's that kind of point. So you can still see everything, even though it's like way smaller than on a full desktop. I didn't know how to share on my phone, but I'm sure that the phone version looks pretty similar to this. So I just thought that that was like a really good example how it gets bigger and then it like spreads out and you can see all this stuff. So very cool. And then if you make it full size, it goes back to desktop size. So that's an example of having a responsive site according to screen size. The way that media queries are like a part of that is that you write them and you set a size for when you want things to start changing. So I will show you an example. So I went ahead and just did this on CodePen because I felt like it was like easier to see the HTML and the CSS with this right next to it. So this is just a simple, like the design principles thing that I was working on that I copied over from my VS Code. But it's got just some really simple CSS here. And then we went ahead and added a couple media queries down here at the bottom. So first of all, the first things that we need to know is how to write a media query. So it always is going to start with the little @ symbol. And then it'll be @ and then media, and then you'll have a parenthesis and then the brackets. And so that's how it's always going to be. You can add different things. Like if you see here, there are some words before, and then here there aren't. So, but it's always going to have those things, the @ media and then the parentheses and the curly brackets. So when you write the query, you're going to put in your parentheses, you're going to set the size where you want things to start changing. Okay, so my site is designed for mobile view, which means that everything is coded. So it's like coded originally with 1 column, right? But then as it starts to get bigger, it changes into 3. So so you see how it's 1 column and then it gets fatter and then, oh, boom, 3 columns. So pretty exciting stuff. There's a couple other things besides just like columns that media queries do that I'll get into in just a little bit. But that's the most important part, is that they're like in the parentheses that you're setting the size where you want it to change. So you can do min width, so like minimum width or maximum width. And it just depends on how you originally coded the CSS. So if you did it for mobile, then you're going to set a minimum width for it to change. So the minimum it can be to have 1 column is 700. And then once it gets bigger than that, then it switches over to 3 columns, right? Or sorry, I think I put 600 and then 700 is when I make the font size bigger. If you coded in reverse, where you if you start with it at the size of a desktop, then you're going to want to do max width. And and then you're gonna like change it so if it gets to a certain, like if it gets to a certain size, like being small, then it will change. Sorry, that was kind of messy, but it makes sense. You guys get it. So if we look here on this media query, I've got, so the minimum width, 600 pixels. And then what it's going to do is it's going to take the CSS that I wrote up here for my main, and it's going to change these things, right? So right here, I have it at one column, so 1FR for the column. But then here, I change it to 3FR, or 1FR 3 times. And so it knows that when it reaches that width, that's what it's going to change to. And I also went ahead and changed the font size, right? Because if it's really small, then there's not a lot of space, and so we're going to make the font size smaller. But as it starts to get bigger, when it switches over into 3 columns, I want the font size to get bigger because I'm assuming that the user is using a bigger screen, and so they can afford to have a larger font size. So that is like another thing that's really nice about media queries is that you can change font size. You can also change positioning of photos. You can change all sorts of different things. Basically, you could change anything that you'd write in CSS and you can have it change. You could change the background color. I don't know why you'd want to do that. I feel like that would kind of give me a headache, but to each his own, I guess. And then what we're going to look at here is a second media query, right? So this one is going to change once we get to 700 pixels, right? So here we like went and we're like, oh, boom, 600 pixels, right? But if we let it get bigger, wait, did I miss it? Oh yeah, okay, here we go. So this is 600. Once we get to 700, the font gets bigger, so that as it gets larger, it fits the screen better. So that was just like a really simple example of having like 2 media queries. Again, you could also change like columns. So a lot of people will do, it'll go from like 1 column to 2 columns to 3 columns. We easily could have coded that as well, but I just didn't in this example. Another thing that I wanted to point out was, oh yeah, so the positioning of where you code the media query. So it's always at the bottom. I don't know if y'all have noticed that in class yet, but the media query is always at the bottom, and that's because your code is going to read it in order. So if, for example, I took this main right here and I placed it after the media query, let's see, control, then it's not going to do anything that I did in the media queries because after it read those, it went ahead and reset it back to the way that the main was anyway. And so that's just, I mean, that's kind of like an obvious rule of coding, but it's especially applicable in media queries because if it's not at the bottom of your code, then whatever you write after it will just override the queries altogether. So that is something to keep in mind. And also it's just, I think it's good to just understand like why things are the way they are. That way, if one day you just decide to mix it up, you don't mix it up like that and mess up your entire code. So I think that is a pretty simple overview of how we use media queries, why they're so useful. Nowadays, it is absolutely essential to make sure that you have a responsive site because of how frequently sites are used on mobile devices and on tablets, not just desktops, but also not just mobile devices is another thing to keep in mind, because if it was only coded for a mobile device, then it would look really weird on a desktop. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. I don't think so, but that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, please just comment in the discussion board. I'd be happy to share anything that I know. And I appreciate y'all watching. Thank you.